And we're live.
All
So
right.
welcome everybody for joining us today as we have another installment of our mental health webinars. And today I'm delighted to introduce to you Colleen Swindoll Thompson. She's our guest today to talk about parenting a child who's been through trauma. There are some unique perspectives and twists that that add a lot of complexity to parenting a child when the child has lived through something traumatic. So we're going to jump right in the conversation here in just a second. But before we do, just want to officially welcome everybody. If you're on the webinar, please feel free to share messages or questions in the chat. If you're on the Facebook Live, we will be checking that periodically, and we'll do our best to add your questions and comments to the discussion as well. And I even got a question this morning by email. So we got a lot to talk about. Just remember, whenever you are commenting, just don't use identifying information. We want to just maintain privacy and just respect all the people involved in whatever situation you're bringing in your mind today as we're talking about this. So Colleen, welcome. Thank you so much for being willing to join us today.
You are very welcome. I'm honored to do it.
Wonderful. Well, I have been a church person my whole life. And so I know that you come from a ministry family, have a lot of years of depth in ministry, but not everybody may be familiar with your background. So if you would just tell everybody a little bit about who you are and, what brings you to having this conversation with us today.
So I grew up as a pastor's kid, and the typical response is, oh, a pastor's kid, like,
right.
Danger.
Yeah.
But I never really acted out or needed to, because my dad gave me as a pastor, he gave me the freedom to be who I was.
Mm-hmm.
But I will also say, behind the scenes, our family was no different from anybody else's family. Just because you have a pastor in your life or in the church, in your family, it does not exempt you from going through trauma.
Right.
And I did experience trauma as a child and through my growing up years. So there's a lot that can be said to pastors about, please learn and know what mental health, mental illness, and what trauma can do, because it is incredibly pervasive.
Right.
Also incredibly non-selective, whether a pastor's family or not. It's our lives that are affected by trauma.
Right. Well, and not only, was your family growing up impacted by trauma, but your family, your children that you've been raising have been impacted by trauma as well. So tell us, if you will, just a little bit about that.
Yep. So first, it's really important to note that I've asked for permission to share anything about my kids, because safety, security, and confidentiality are super, super important.
Yes.
But yes, I was previously married and have three children that are now, and I have to look at my notes because I can't even remember their ages, but they're 28, 26, 23.
Wow. Okay.
And part of growing up in trauma or having experienced trauma as a child and through my youth, you don't really know what to look for with trauma. And so I didn't know what to look for or I just married into a system that I was familiar with. And that included trauma and wanting to please and try and fix and try and make things different. But it was a very traumatic marriage that lasted 16 years.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, then that definitely takes a toll, particularly if, there's special needs thrown into the mix, and you actually have that, right? I mean,
yeah, we're a lot of crazy around here, but we're okay with that.
Oh, yeah. Well, makes for interesting dinner time conversations and
Yeah.
conversations like this, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
we've got a few colorful ones.
yes, yes. So for your child who has experienced trauma, what are some of the things that have been really helpful for that child to kind of walk through that and not expect that to be a normal part of life going forward? Because I hear what you're saying. If you grow up in an environment that um I mean, everybody does their best, right? I mean, I think that is absolutely what I'm hearing you say, in your growing up experience. Um, but we're all impacted by both nature and nurture. And, if we don't deal with things properly as a child, we tend to not deal with them very well as adults either. So what have you done maybe a little differently with your children to help them, have a different outlook on how to handle difficult circumstances in their own lives as adults?
Well, I have this little fairy who has magical fairy dust and just sprinkles healing.
Oh,
I
can I
wish.
can I buy that fairy? Can I rent it?
Exactly. She passed away a long time ago.
Yeah.
I think there are several precursors to that question.
Okay.
So I have some notes that I'm going to be referring to, but I think it's
Yeah.
super, super important for us to understand. First of all, what is trauma?
Mhm.
Because it can sound like it's easily thought or assumed, well, someone who's been raped has trauma,
Right.
or someone who's been in war has trauma.
Right.
PTSD
Right.
is really only for veterans, and that completely is not true.
Right.
Trauma, in fact, the definition of it is, as I look through here, any overwhelming situation or circumstance that causes us to feel threatened for our life, our
Mhm.
livelihood, or removes our hope
Mhm.
and our outlook and changes our perspective on life.
Mhm.
That's huge
Yeah.
right there.
Covers a lot of
So,
territory.
yes, it does. And the reason I share it that way is because I want people to be healed from trauma, but we have to know what we're dealing with before we can ever heal from something.
Right.
So the various traumatic experiences that can be had, physical and sexual assault, of course, are typical thoughts of trauma, but also mental and emotional abuse, which can include intimidation,
Mhm.
coercion, harassment.
Mhm.
Talk about bullying in schools right now.
Right.
Not right this year, but bullying in general. Treating an adult like a child, belittling, name calling, isolating, um, and and not allowing the child to be an individual,
Right.
be part of narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder. But I don't want to throw out labels because it's beyond labels.
Right.
Another form of trauma, and I think water would be great. Another form of trauma is exploitation, which occurs when a vulnerable person or his or her resources or income are illegally or improperly used for another person's profit or gain. That's really, really important right now, is that when someone robs another person of their livelihood or their ability to function in life, that is traumatic for that person. How
Yeah.
do they move forward? Neglect is another one, which occurs when a person either thought his or her actions or inactions deprive them of the care necessary for maintaining a typical daily life experience.
Mhm.
Self-neglect, and then also abandonment. Abandonment occurs when a vulnerable person is left without the ability to obtain food, clothing, or the necessary resources to be successful or be alive in this world and able to move forward. So there are a lot of various kinds of trauma beyond just physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, I think it's really important to also state that physical abuse and neglect and the kinds of abuses that we think of, sexual abuse, they all involve psychological and emotional abuse.
Mhm.
So there's not one kind of abuse that will be separate from emotional and psychological. And in my opinion, that involves spiritual, because we are made as whole people by
Right,
God,
right,
and we can't separate the mind and the body.
right, right. Yeah, and back in January, we had Pastor Brad Hambrick join us to talk about trauma, and I thought this was just such an excellent point that he made, that what's traumatic for an 8-year-old is not necessarily going to be traumatic for an 18-year-old or a 28-year-old or a 38-year-old. So, it very much depends on what stage a child is in developmentally, as
Yes.
if something difficult will help or cause them to sort of be stuck in that moment that was so difficult for them.
Right.
And then children, I shouldn't say in particular, but children are so vulnerable. They're so dependent on their parents. And if if something is happening to their parent, they absolutely can struggle with secondary trauma.
Yes.
Or children who are siblings of perhaps a child who has medical complexities, and is hospitalized all the time, can very much experience secondary trauma. In fact, I got a question this morning from someone who is, I don't think, able to join us today, but let me just talk about this for a second, because I think that that is probably something that a lot of our audience has experienced or is thinking about. She has a 11-year-old son who they think has PTSD, because his younger sister was medically fragile, and the first couple of years of life had lots of surgeries, hospitalizations out of state, just a very unstable environment, not only for the child who had all of the medical complexities, but for the sibling.
Yeah.
And it's really important that parents not overlook what's going on for the siblings, in addition for the child that rightfully demands so much immediate attention.
Yeah.
So
And that's a really hard one, because as a parent, you're trying to juggle the child that's medically fragile,
yeah,
or like I was told, I don't know if he's going to live through the night. That's a
right,
secondary trauma for me, because
right,
as a parent of a child who is in extreme physical trauma and emotional trauma, doesn't have the capacity to understand why all these needles are going into his body.
right,
You know,
right,
then I have trauma that I carry with me. So
sure,
there is kind of a domino effect, but I think it's really important for us to note that 4 critical areas we need to attend to. First is the age of onset.
mhm,
So how old is the child or is the individual when that traumatic event occurred or series of events occurred? Because as a 1-year-old, they're less capable and have less coping skills than an 11-year-old,
right,
than a 21-year-old. So
right,
the age of onset, the intensity and severity of trauma. There are
mhm,
some that have an intensity that is so high, we don't want to even imagine that it can happen, but it does. And then there's the severity of it. There's also the duration. Did it last? Was it one event? Was it 20 events? Was
right,
it countless events?
right,
And then the proximity. Most abuses happen in the family of origin or a relationship within the family of origin.
right,
And in the world of disabilities, people with disabilities are 4 to 8 times more likely to experience trauma and assaults for a longer period of time. And most likely it's the person they're dependent upon.
mhm,
So you have a setup that is very few coping mechanisms, very few abilities for the disabled community to comprehend what's happening.
right,
And then the secondary trauma is not being believed
right,
about what's been going on. So there's a lot to take in. It's not just, oh, well, I saw this event. I mean, a car accident can be very traumatic for someone. for someone like me, I've had several car accidents. They weren't nearly as traumatic as other things that I have faced that have been traumatic. So the person's constitution, how engaged are the parents with their son or daughter to notice they're starting to act differently. There's something going on beyond what we understand. So
Right.
those are some of the peripheral, if I can say, those are some of the things to really be aware of. And then when it comes back into my family, I have secondary trauma. Well, I have primary trauma, PTSD, from childhood that I worked through very, very hard. But also with Jonathan, my son with disabilities, having medically fragile and life-threatening issues come up, I couldn't do anything but hold him while they tried to find a vein to
Right.
get medicine in him. It was so traumatic.
Right.
So I don't want to ever discount someone's response to a situation because I don't know the environment they were raised in. I don't know the education that they have. And I don't know how engaged they are with people who are safe.
Yeah. And I think that, a lot of times people don't have a good, if they don't have a good kind of toolbox of how to cope with difficult situations, they just assume that their way is normal, while leaving perhaps a trail of destruction in their wake. So that's kind of one end of trauma. I kind of see the other end as, so, you're a parent of a child who has been through some really difficult things. There's always the temptation to overprotect that child.
Oh
And I just think that that has got to be so difficult to balance. When you see something coming up again in this child, who has needed so much, how do you how do you not overprotect the child? So, I mean, have you found a good way, particularly as your child is now an adult, have you found a good way, whether just in the way that you have worked through the trauma, your own and your child's, or have you found specific resources that you could recommend for parents who are watching this, who have a child that they want them to grow into that independence, but it's just this really delicate dance with what they've been through?
Yeah. So with my neurotypical children, well, first of all, I want to say as a mom, I believe that the Lord entrusts our children to us as a Christian, which is my faith. So I want to honor the Lord to the best of my ability with how I raise them. How do I separate myself from my kids' trauma? That's a hard question, Catherine. And I still struggle with it at times because I think, well, I know how to handle this, or I know what he's saying, or I know whatever. And with my older daughter, I noticed that she had some scars on her arm. And I knew that our environment was hostile at the time. And so I just asked her about it. And I'll get back around to your question about handling it as a parent. But I asked her, honey, what is that on your arm? Because really, let me back up and say, trying to talk with someone who has been traumatized or is in that fight or flight response constantly is like trying to communicate with someone who's underwater. When I grew up with we had a little swimming pool in our backyard, and my brother and I used to swim for hours, and we would try and talk underwater and guess what each other was saying. Well, that was completely impossible because we're underwater.
Right.
But for a parent to try and communicate with a child who is quote unquote underwater, they're going to hear things differently. They're not going to be able to complete the thoughts as we want them to. So with my daughter, it took me diving into her underwater world and observing she's hurting. And I can throw out all all the life graphs I want, but if she's weighted down by that water and that trauma and is terrified to come to the surface, she's not going to. So when I entered into her world, she said, Mom, when you stop talking, then I was able to really believe you were listening and interested in me. And I just listened to her share that she was self-harming, that she was cutting, which is very common of emotional, psychological abuse,
Right.
and a very unhealthy family system.
Right.
So instead of, because I'm a natural, I tend to be very empathetic. I had to step back and put on my mom hat and say, okay, what does she love that will communicate to her what word picture? And she loved rabbits and she loves animals. But at the time we had rabbits. And I said, Ashley, what would happen if you would just throw your animal, your little rabbit into the street? Wouldn't you want to go, would you rescue them or would you just let them get hit by a car? So I had to enter into her world and connect with things that she loved, because that showed her I was connecting with her emotionally, not just with information, because I could spill that out all over the place. That wasn't effective.
Right.
When I entered into her world and said, I'm hearing you. Tell me what you're going through. That's when the conversation became very real. And that's when her healing started.
Wow. I mean, I think that's just so powerful is to really to listen, not just to the words, but to what the person's trying to convey from their heart, from their innermost being that is obviously struggling. So, was that something that, no right or wrong here? I mean, was that something that a counselor recommended to you, or you just in that moment, God just really impressed on you that that was where you needed to go for your daughter?
It was a natural follow-up because I had done so many years of cognitive behavioral therapy, and I had someone enter my world. And when I was exploring my own history, my therapist said, I want you to go look up the word abuse. I want you to look up trauma. And then you tell me, because I would revert to being very cognitive or intellectual about it. Well, we can talk about this intellectually, but that's a coping mechanism. That's not healing.
Right.
So when I went and looked it up, I thought, I have lived so much of my life in fear. I have lived a lot of my life in terror. I don't know a day that I haven't felt some kind of fear. And that's what we were working on. And I was being loved through and healing from that kind of fear. The world doesn't have to be scary. So as I became healthier, then I was able to then respond to my daughter. And of course, I knew that word pictures, that's how Jesus taught. I mean, I'm looking out at my trees, wishing they didn't have as many leaves right now, but I was looking, he uses things that we can grasp. And at the time with my kids, they couldn't grasp a huge statement on trauma or abuse. All they could grasp was, Mom gets me.
Yeah.
Mom understands and she's listening to me. I have a safe place. And that's the first lifeline, I would say, is for a parent to realize you have a choice to be a lifeline. You have the choice to listen or to avoid. And I'm not going to avoid it. And in the church, 49% of pastors, a Lifeway research in 2019 discovered 49 to 50% of pastors rarely ever speak on mental health because it's an unknown topic and it's not controllable. It doesn't need to be. It's the fact that we're in a fallen world and we need practical things to connect with one another. And for my daughter, it was the love of her rabbits. That connected with her. With my son, it was another thing. With my other son who has disabilities, it's a completely different thing. But becoming as healthy as I could be was step one.
Yeah.
And then allowing them to say, this is happening to me. This is what's going on. And not me saying, why would you say that about so-and-so?
Right.
Or that shaming, it's re-victimizing, and it adds to it. It makes trauma turn into complex trauma.
Right. Well, and I just want to jump in here. Make sure if you have a question or a comment that you'd like to address to Colleen, that you add it in the chat or you add it in Facebook Live, because we are monitoring both, and don't want you to miss out on your opportunity while we have Colleen here with us until 1 o'clock. So, we've talked around and about the differences in trauma for a young child versus, say, a teen and then a young adult. So, what do you think some of the priorities should be, or what, you mentioned, about getting help for yourself, and also, being a safe person or a listening person for your child. What other priorities would you offer to a parent who maybe has a child who's, say, under the age of 10 versus a teen? I mean, what are a couple of differences that you would see that they should really be focusing on if they've got a child with trauma today?
Okay, so with children, we have to remember that their coping development is less than maybe someone with a teen, healthy or unhealthy coping mechanisms, however they're trying to navigate. I tend to find that younger children are very honest. They are not familiar with a lot of things like sexuality, parts of the body. And when they start talking about those things, talk about genitals and talk about nakedness that that they haven't been exposed to in your own home, you need to listen up, because they're trying to make it and they're telling you something that they wouldn't normally know. When it comes to teenage years, then you have some defensiveness because they're trying to become more of their own person, yet you still look at the behaviors. So with younger children, I listen to what they say and I watch what they do. With teens or older individuals, I will look at the nonverbals, because there's so much shame involved with having been traumatized. How do you come out and say, so-and-so did this to me without feeling complete shame or embarrassment? It just comes with any kind of abuse. So children,
that feeling of responsibility is often there as well.
Yes. And that's a really good point, Catherine, because the sibling question, there can be survivor guilt,
Right.
which is, I wasn't there. I should have been there, especially if you have a disability involved. The siblings can become very protective, even though they get terribly frustrated. It's like, I should have been there and I wasn't. Well, as a mom, I've had to grieve that. I should have known. I should have been there. I should have been more present. You know what, Catherine? We're human. And we have to have a resource bigger than ourselves,
Right.
which is the Lord.
Yeah.
To say, I couldn't be all places at all times, but Lord, you were, and you haven't made a mistake. I've got to go back to the fundamental truths of Scripture for my foundation to be strong, to then embrace, okay, with my son, developmentally, when he was assaulted repeatedly and came back, I thought, I need to get him into a safe place. I need to be a safe person. I need to connect with people who know how to help me. I had to admit it was bigger than me.
Yeah.
A lot of parents want to handle it on their own.
Right.
You can't.
Yeah.
If my jugular is cut, I am calling the ambulance and I am getting into the hospital. That's how it is for our kids. As parents, the requirement is to care for what is needed at that moment. So safety, security, protection, repeating back to them, I love you. You are safe with mom or with dad or whoever. You can tell me anything. If they can't talk, have them draw, have them watch how they play with their stuffed animals.
Mm-hmm.
That is very telling. how they do imaginary play. So they'll act out a lot of the things that they may not be able to verbalize.
Right.
So with a teen, it would be to be available to say, I'm noticing that you're not eating anymore, or you've lost some weight, or you've gained some weight. I'm sensing that getting up is really hard for you. You're very tired. I remember in high school coming home, and because of what I had internalized, I just wanted to go to sleep. It was too hard to be awake. That is a sign. And as a parent who is healthy and safe, not one that's going to come in and judge and accuse, but say, I need to know more about that. I want to know what you think is causing you to be so tired. What is making this difficult for you? And just listen. So a couple of things, realize it's bigger than what you can handle. Seek help for your own, as an adult or as a parent, seek help for your own support, which I have pursued more in the last 2 years than ever in my life, because I know I don't have all the tools for it. And other people do have gifts that God's given them that they can use. Then to find very wise, educated, and knowledgeable, but empathetic caregivers, therapists, people who can speak into areas that I'm not an expert at. So when John, or with my older kids, when something comes up, I have a resource team that I will go to saying, and Steve is one of them. In fact, Ministries is one of them. I don't know what to do here. I need help. Ask for help, but from people who are safe and secure and will listen without judgment. Another thing is to not care, well, what are other people going to think?
Right. Amen.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
What matters is you're raising a child that God made, whether they are 2 or 22. As a parent in a family system, be responsible to honor the Lord with what they bring to you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, those are excellent points. Just jumping in here again, make sure if you've got a comment or a question that you add them in the webinar chat or on the Facebook Live. And thanks so much for joining, those of you who are on the Facebook Live. So you mentioned that you do have like an established set of resources. Do you, so has that shifted over the years as you've had younger children and now older children? Like, did you start off, say, with their pediatrician and maybe, I'm struggling for what I'm looking for here, but like a younger child type support system, and has that changed as they've gotten older? I would expect yes, but I kind of want to hear what your experience has been, because that might be helpful for those who are listening.
Yes and no. It has changed in some ways, but we also have to remember that trauma affects the physiology of the body. So when a younger child is traumatized, their brain is still forming. It will actually change the neural pathways in their brain. So I won't get too nerdy on you, but we have to remember that we're created physically, emotionally, spiritually, and it's all connected. So in the younger years, I would look at physiology, genetics, neural pathways. There are new treatments that are being discovered for medically resistant people who have depression and who have trauma, which is really important to know. What are the genetics that you carry? My son and I carry a genetic mutation that lends itself towards depression. We don't synthesize certain medications. So be very, very attentive and aware of your own body and what it can and can't tolerate for healing. And has it changed over the years? I think giving my kids words, we've used feeling word charts. We've gone through forgiveness processes. We've worked on a schedule and having things simplified so they're freed up to address what comes bubbling up. Because trauma, the God-given gift, is the fight or flight response.
Right.
Our blood goes to the major organs for survival, and we are going to survive. It also causes the brain to be frozen. So with older kids, we need to address, how is their brain functioning? How are they processing the information that we're hearing? And a lot of reflective feedback. I hear you saying, or it sounds like, and then give 3 emotional words. It sounds like you're feeling really afraid to be around that person. Is that right? And then they may say, no, I actually am really angry. Let them tell you their emotions. So an emotional word chart is very, very healthy.
Excellent.
There are sites that are fantastic for trauma, because we are now learning so much more about it. I would say for parents, go look up resources. Let's put them in the chat because I can't think of them offline.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it does change. A lot of it depends on the cognition of your son or daughter or your loved one, their capacity to verbalize, and the resources that as a parent you've provided them. Have you allowed them to have feelings?
Right.
Because a feeling word chart's really not going to work well if you want to shut them down.
Right.
So allow that feeling or feelings to be brought up, and then let them draw it, let them journal it, let them whatever it needs to come out, because they want to be happy. They don't want to live caged up.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Well, so there's a question in the chat, when your kids are having an especially hard day, just dealing with life, how do you help them? Knowing that trauma is present or has been present.
Oh my goodness. You just make them do 1,000 things. No, I'm kidding. I think it's being very gentle, not excusing responsibilities that they may have.
Right.
But there were days where I said, this is a mental health day and we're not going to go to school. We're going to stay home and we're going to color, and we're going to do things that are very, what's called grounding or anchoring. We're going to take a walk. We're going to just be outside in the sunshine. If it's raining and freezing cold, let's stay in and sit by the fire. Natural elements are very healing.
Right.
Being in the sun, being by the fire, being by water. Water is my total love language.
Oh yeah, same here.
But bringing them back to a place of, I'm with you in this. Presence is essential because trauma is isolating.
Right.
So being with someone, you don't have to say anything or have the perfect words. It's, you know what, honey, I love you. I'm sad that you're suffering and I'm here with you. Yeah. Just being available and open. So yeah, we had mental health days and there were days where we just skipped school.
Yeah. Well, and there's another question in the chat that, talks about, how you stay full and healthy and have something to give your kids, and have the energy to help them day after day. Well, I mean, I think mental health days are a great way to meet not only their needs, but also your needs. Yeah. If you can just take a break, because it just seems like if you're doing the same thing over and over again, I mean, it's like the whole Einstein quote that, that expecting a different result is insanity. Well, it's the same thing with living your life every day. If you're not able to kind of reclaim your stress or kind of push it back where it belongs or help it get out, however you want to look at it, doing something different can be the key that just kind of unlocks all of that and will let you be able to move forward. So I don't mean to do all the talking here, but, so mental health days, what are some other things that you've done to help yourself stay healthy so you can be healthy for your kids?
I've had people in my life tell me you need to have a break and you're not healthy right now.
Okay. Well, there's a clue right there, right?
Yep. And there are times where I am more stressed out than I realize, or I'm more and more thin than I realize, not physically after COVID, but emotionally. And so I have people who I allow speak into my life because I can't do it all. And I want to be as healthy as I can be. Yeah. And we all have those blind spots. So I invite people that I trust and that I know are mature and safe to speak into my life. Where do you see that I need to work on this? What do you see? My executive assistant is amazing. And she will say, you're overscheduling. You're not going to be ready for that. I thought after neck surgery, I'd be ready to be back on things. I can hear her laughing right now. She's like, you thought you'd be back within 8 weeks?
Yeah.
I'm like, well, yeah. She's like, yeah, I think that's just a little overachieving, which is one of my things. So people speaking into my life to help me lower the expectations of how do we live. A lot of times we can look around and see people living and assume, oh, they're just doing so much better, when really on the inside, they may be suffering just as much as we are.
Yeah.
So I have people around me and in my circle. My husband also speaks into that. My kids speak into it. I have told my kids, you are safe to say anything to mom that is on your heart. I will listen to you. And if it's something that I may not agree with, I'll listen to it and then I'll process it. And then we'll reconnect when it's a good time that we can talk through certain things. So open communication is another thing. Being just very, very honest.
Yeah.
Last night, I even talked to one of my sons. I was like, well, what did help you? And he goes, Mom, it was really the permission to be vulnerable.
Wow. That's something to admit for a young man. That's amazing.
I was like, I need to know what really helped you, because I'm not in your head. So you tell me. He goes, you allowed me to be vulnerable. You allowed me to say, this is my struggle, or this is the addiction I struggle with, or this is whatever that I've gone through, without telling me, don't tell or keep secrets. Another thing is we have surprises, not secrets.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good perspective.
When surprises are wonderful, but secrets, no. And triangles, when there's a communication where there's a triangle, and you have one person talking to this person about this person, it's going to be a lose deal. Just don't even do that. So go right to the person and say, I'm listening. But that does require that we're healthy. And I would also say, Catherine, my relationship with Jesus Christ has been transformed through the healing process and the ongoing traumas that we face. I can't do it without asking Jesus. Help.
Boy, I mean, that's Romans 8:28. If there ever was an application, for Romans 8:28. I mean, nobody wants to suffer, but when Jesus will be that part of the triangle,
right,
then you can't.
He's like right up at the top.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Well, so another question in the chat, what are some routines that you've established within your family that can help with decision fatigue? I mean, that's something that we, hear a fair amount in special needs ministry, because it is overwhelming to have to think about so many things all the time.
So the question again is, what is helping with decision?
What routines, or what, you talked about having the emotion chart for your kid, or you mentioned something maybe 15 minutes ago about, helping your kids maybe not have to make so many decisions at certain times. So, what are those kind of processes or systems that you put in place, either for yourself or your kids, that help minimize the number of decisions?
Okay. So one thing is when you simplify. So the space around a person will often reveal what's going on inside a person. So if there's a lot of chaos in the room, meaning there's a pile of stuff here and unfolded stuff there and whatever, to create a space in the home where there isn't a lot of distraction is very important. I play quiet music because music is very soothing. So sometimes it's quietness or just quiet music playing. Physical touch is really, really huge. Physical safe touch, especially if there's been damaging, abusive, sexual touch that's been wrong. So I rub John's feet in the evening. The nerve connections and all of our organs connect to our feet and our hands. So I do physically massage his feet with oils and his hands. And then just setting up a routine, not rigid, but breakfast is at this time and lunch is at this time and dinner's at this time.
Mhm.
So there's something they can depend upon because internally their world is out of control.
Mhm.
So it's kind of like if meteors are flying around in the space, you're that one space station that's stable
Mhm.
and it's protected. Simplifying, going on walks again, or just being present and coloring, having making sure that there are not unexpected interruptions in the day as much as possible. That may mean turning off your cell phone for a week.
Amen.
Honestly,
Yeah.
that may mean
Yeah.
getting off of all social media.
Right.
I would attend to what voices are coming into their lives.
Right.
So if social media is something that they can't live without, why? Why
Right.
is there such a dependence on that? Because it takes us away from being present. So I would say a schedule that works with the family system, and that's hard when you have a child with disabilities or a loved one that you're caring for. We have parents and children. So it's on both sides, but that's the most common caregiver scenario.
Right.
How do I create a routine when I'm caregiving to an adult who may have to have a diaper changed, who
Right.
may not be able to talk, who is throwing up? And also, how do I care for my other two children when my son is in the hospital? I had special times where each of my kids, my older two kids, would come and stay with me in the hospital.
Mhm.
So I'd have a night or two where they spent the night with me in the hospital, and we put our coloring books in the hallway and we colored when John was asleep. It was just them knowing I was there and present and dependable.
Right.
Does that help at all?
I think very much so. I mean, it's a, you know, a visual of actual structure that you put in place for your family. And I mean, most kids thrive on structure, but particularly those who have lived through something that is just impossible for them to really understand or um, to handle in a good way for their age and maturity level.
And let me just say this too. It sounds great coming out of my mouth right now, but I have ADHD so bad that I'm like, Lord, you kind of picked the wrong mother for a child that is a specter, because I have none. So I've needed people to come into my life
Right.
who have shown me what that looks like.
Well, I was
And
just going to ask you, like, you know, how the church, if the church has been helpful in this, you know, with helping your family with the trauma aspect of the things that you've gone through. You know, we talk all the time about attend to the practical needs of the families that have mental health struggles, because that's not different than the family that's going through the cancer diagnosis and the treatments. Um, you know, that's another, I mean, I think that that's a way of relieving the decision fatigue. You know, if you
yes,
know that somebody's bringing you dinner, you don't have to think
that's
about
huge.
dinner.
Yeah, a
Yes.
meal is huge.
Yeah. Or you know
Great.
somebody's going to take your kid to ball practice. You don't have to think about that.
Yes.
So, I mean, this can just be, it can be life-giving and life-changing in a positive way for
Yes.
churches to step into this kind of ministry. So tell us, I mean, are there things that your church has done that have helped you, you know, with your ADHD, but also, you know, with the needs of your family?
Um, that's a direct question, and I want to be gentle in my response.
Yes, yes, of course.
And no, I did not find a lot of Christian support. I found a lot of Christian ease, of, well, you should do this. The
Mhm.
fixing, like trying to fix me or fix our situation.
Yeah,
There was betrayal, honestly. There
yeah.
was the, well, why do you feel like that? Questioning. A lot of times women who report that they've been raped find that the detective or the pastor will question their situation before they will listen.
Mhm.
You know, what were you wearing? What time were you out? All of those are so accusatory.
Mhm.
It's, let's start with, tell me what you experienced,
Mhm.
and then let's unpack this together.
Right.
So I would love to say the church was the first to respond. Now, when it comes to casseroles, all about that.
Right.
fabulous. And I would never, I so appreciated that. I had people who did laundry. I had a family who paid for my carpets to be cleaned. Those were amazing.
Mhm.
And yet I needed the emotional space to say, this is what's happening.
Mhm.
So the church in general, my suggestion is to become as comfortable as I am in my skin, then that's the degree that I can give to somebody else.
Mhm.
So first address, why is this an uncomfortable topic for me?
Mhm.
Why am I not wanting to go into that space?
Right.
And then address that and take responsibility for it. And then just become available and say, I'm here. I want to listen. How can I help you? Another point is people in trauma or who are struggling will often not ask for help. I didn't know how to ask for help, and I still am working on that one. So I heard of one gal, I think it was actually Sheryl Sandberg from her book. It's not Plan B, that's another book. But
Yeah, I know what you're talking about too,
Yeah.
but I can't think of the name.
But she had someone who said, I'm going to be in the waiting room of the hospital for the next 2 hours. And I would love to talk with you if you need to talk. But if you don't need to talk, I'm totally okay. And she didn't go down to talk at that point because she just wasn't ready to. So being available, but not intrusive
Mhm.
is very helpful.
Somebody just said it, the book is option B.
Thank you. Yes, it is. It was such a great book because she really was very realistic about it. It's not a Christian book, but it's
Right.
very helpful. Another book that I think is fantastic is The Body Keeps Score, because now we are finding out there's so much more neurobiology to trauma
Right.
and recovery.
Right. Right. Yeah. One thing that I really appreciate about you is that you talk about how, holistic approaches are so important. And, my perspective is that, far too much of the medicine and the treatment options that we see in our culture are very siloed. And it's really only when those things work together, mind, body, and spirit, that you
Yeah.
can really, get to the heart of issues and therefore get to the right solutions for people. So, well, we've got about 5 more minutes, and I just want to give you an opportunity to share any particular resources or websites or scripture that you would like to share with our audience, since this is a Christian discussion. Christians are probably the people that are signed on to this discussion, so would just love to hear any of those things that you would recommend to someone who may really be struggling today who's watching.
So I'm going to say, let's put the resources or the websites that I have, and I have pages of them.
Yeah.
We can put that in the notes,
Okay.
but more than anything, what saved my heart and my soul when I found out that my son with disabilities was, he was so assaulted, was knowing that Jesus Christ tells us he is acquainted with our grief. There's nothing that we go through that he hasn't gone through. The Roman prisons were awful, and that's where he was as a captive before he was put on the cross. So my saving grace was finding that Jesus understood my anger, my sorrow, my grief. And you can still see trauma comes out because it's been part of my life. But I had to go to a source that was stronger than a book, an outline, a seminar, and that was to Jesus Christ. And he tells us in James that, I have to get my tissue, which is really my roll of toilet paper because I cry all the time. He says, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you face trials of all kinds. And in the Greek, the word trials is the word that we would in English use for polka dotted. They're going to be big trials. They're going to be small trials. And count it all joy does not mean I take joy in the situation. I hate the situations that have caused trauma for my kids and myself.
Yes.
But I count it joy now, not what they went through, but what God did in my soul, because I couldn't have talked on this 5-10 years ago. I wasn't equipped.
Yes.
Had I not gone through what we've gone through, I wouldn't know to just search for the Lord, that his word says we're going to have trials. It's going to suck. If I can say suck on this, I hope
Absolutely.
I can. It's going to be really crappy. And there are people that will take advantage of other people, not in a paranoid. I'm not paranoid, but I am saying be aware. And that's going to be hard to endure. But there is a person named Jesus who gets it. And when you call out to him, he listens. And sometimes it feels like he doesn't. But our feelings will ebb and flow. And so we have to go to Romans 8. And the end of it is saying, there is nothing that will separate you from the love of Christ. There is nothing that will separate you from him. When you know that he is your savior and accept him as your savior and say, Jesus, I can't do this life alone. I need you to enter my heart and my life and be my savior and help me walk through this, because sometimes he is the only and the very best companion, having endured the worst of the worst that we could imagine. I've never met someone, well, let me say this. I've never known someone who's gone and been crucified, much less risen from the dead.
Right.
The worst possible death. If he endured that, he can endure anything I say to him, anything I bring to him, and embrace me and walk with me through it. It's not a quick fix,
Right.
but that's the foundation. I don't know how, I don't have another answer than that.
Well, and I think that's the best answer, and it's the truth. Jesus is the God of many scars, and a person who has been beat up and scarred on behalf of another person is somebody you can trust.
Yeah. And there are great people. There's some YouTube channels that I'll refer people to. Diane Langberg's great.
Yeah.
Joe Padilla is great. Matt Stanford is great. There are books that are fabulous. Jolene Philo, Does My Child Have PTSD? I read that book, and as I was reading it, I'm thinking, I've got PTSD.
I'm that child. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I called her. I'm like, Jolene, I'm reading this for my son. I think it's for me too. So there are definitely people who have dealt with the trenches of it and can offer resources that are helpful for the toolbox. But to hold the tools, that belongs to the Lord. Yeah. In my world, it does.
Yeah. Well, I hate to leave you on
no,
I know.
You and I can talk all day.
Yes, yes. And this has been so helpful. And I just, I hope that those who are watching will take time to watch this again, because there was a lot that you unpacked here. We will be listing resources in the show notes on our Vimeo and YouTube channel. And just, I would love to have you again sometime, Colleen, as one of our guests. So thank you so much for taking your time today to share with our audience. Thank you for your children who gave permission for you to talk about this, because I know, even if they've dealt with it well, it's not always an easy thing to enter into, either, knowing that mom is or themselves. So just want to make sure, if you haven't looked lately, we have information about Inclusion Fusion Live on our website. Registration is open. We're doing things a little differently this year, so be sure to go check it out. We have both in-person, regional locations, and virtual options. So we hope that everybody watching will go sign up. Sorry. So
don't sign out.
Yeah, not sign out.
But yeah, you guys do an amazing job covering the bases of a lot of this stuff. The River Conference was just in our area at Prestonwood Baptist Church last weekend. That was a great one.
Yeah.
Also with Reframing Ministries, the ministry that I'm leading up, we're here. We have a email private emails so people can write in, Reframing Ministries at insight.org, and also resources where they can connect with me. They can connect with people who will really listen and care about walking with those who have gone through trauma. American Association of Christian Counselors is another great one.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I could name a bunch, but we'll put them in the notes.
Yep, that sounds great. Well, thank you again, Colleen. And for Key Ministry, I'm Catherine Boyle. Join us again next time. Thank you. Bye.